The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by the British Crown, acknowledges Aboriginal land rights as not having been ceded to or purchased by the U.S. are reserved to them. Starting in the early 1830s, over 150,000 of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were forced to attend residential schools in an attempt to aggressively assimilate them into the dominant culture. These children, many of which still live in Canada, could no longer communicate with their parents and grandparents, causing many of their native languages to be left in the past. Children were brutally starved, beaten, and many were raped while forced to live in these boarding-type schools. The Gradual Civilization Act of 1857 requires that all Native males over the age of 21 who can speak, read, and write English or French will be enfranchised, meaning that they must renounce their Indian status and become a British subject. In 1876, the Indian Act is enacted, which gives the government exclusive right to create legislation regarding Indians and their lands. This act defines who is an Indian and establishes related legal rights. In 1889, allegations emerged of physical and sexual abuse at Rupert's Land School in Selkirk, Manitoba. In 1892, the federal government and certain Christian churches enter into a formal agreement to operate residential schools. In 1896, 45 residential schools are open across Canada, but in 1907, Medical Inspector for Indian Affairs Dr. P.H. Bryce reports that health conditions in the residential schools are a national crime. In 1906, an amendment to the Indian Act states that Aboriginal peoples can be removed from reserves near towns with more than 8,000 inhabitants. In 1914, an amendment to the Indian Act states that Western Aboriginals must seek official permission before appearing in Aboriginal costume in any public dance, show, exhibition, stampede, or pageant. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, makes residential school attendance compulsory for children between the ages of 7 and 15. By 1940, the federal government begins to apply provincial curriculum standards to residential schools and to integrate Aboriginal students into regular schools. In 1958, Indian Affairs regional inspectors recommend the abolishment of residential schools. In 1961, Aboriginals are able to vote without having to give up their Indian status. In 1969, the partnership between the government and the churches ends. Transfer of control of the residential schools to the Indian bands begins. Shortly after this, roughly 1,200 students are still enrolled in 12 residential schools across Canada. In 1977, the Burger Inquiry Final Report recommends no gas pipeline be built until land claims are settled, setting a new precedent for relations between Aboriginal peoples and the federal government. In 1982, the Constitution Act is amended and now recognizes and affirms the rights of Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. In 1990, the Oka crisis between the Mohawk Nation and the town of Oka, Quebec, began on March 11th and lasted 6 months. It was the first in a series of violent conflicts in the late 20th century between Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian government. In 1991, Phil Fontaine, later the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, speaks publicly about the abuse he suffered at residential schools. Shortly following, in 1995, Arthur Henry Plint, former supervisor of a residential school, pleads guilty to 16 counts of incident assault against students. He is sentenced to 11 years in prison. In 1996, the last federally run residential school, the Gordon Indian Residential School of Saskatchewan, closes. In 1998, the federal government issues Gathering Strength, Canada's Aboriginal Action Plan, which is designed to renew the relationship with Aboriginal people of Canada. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation is established to manage a $350 million healing fund over 10 years. Although the First Nations people of Canada are treated better by the Canadian government than they have ever been, Canada's history with First Nations people has been named a genocide, as defined by the 1948 UN Convention of Genocide. It's clear that Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald's policy of starving First Nations to death in order to make way for the Western expansions of European settlers meets the criteria of genocide. Through the Canadian government's action and healing plan, the mistreatment of the First Nations people of Canada will hopefully be forgiven, yet acknowledged by our country, the world, and our government.